We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 155. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Paul Zimmerman. Today we have a guest that is teaching computers to identify pottery types in the American Southwest. Let's get to it. All right, welcome to the show, everybody. Paul couldn't join me today because we are on a slightly different recording schedule because Paul actually presented an article to me over our Slack channel that we used to talk about this show last week. And I took a look at it and I was like, oh man, this is super cool. And then I saw one of the names in the article and it turns out I was Facebook friends with him. So I ended up contacting him. Couldn't do it on Thursday, which is Paul and I's normal recording time. So we're recording it on a Saturday, which Paul unfortunately couldn't make. So I'm hoping him and I can wrap this up at some point and get Paul's thoughts on this. But in the meantime, let me welcome to the show, Leszek Pawlowicz. Welcome to the show, Leszek.
Good to be here.
All right. So, I normally when we do interviews, I send out a link and you respond and you put in your bio and all that stuff. But we kind of usurped that entire process for this one. I just kind of reached out and we did it. So why don't you just give your quick background in archaeology and how you come up to today, and then we'll talk about the article that we're going to bring up for the show.
All right. So my original educational background was not in archaeology. Got a bachelor's in physics and astronomy and a PhD in material science and engineering from MIT, and worked in the semiconductor field for about 10 years or so. Then decided I didn't want to do that anymore. Spent a few years as a computer consultant, and then worked as a computer consultant for a CRM firm. And one day they asked me, can you walk in a straight line and find stuff? And I said, sure. And just by process of osmosis, I guess, I picked up a lot of information about archaeology and worked as a field archaeologist for a little bit longer than a decade. But over the past few years, as I've gotten too old to do that crap, I have been working as adjunct faculty at Northern Arizona University, specializing in applications of digital technology to archaeology.
Wow, that is awesome. You hear different careers of people that come to archaeology, the ones that didn't go straight in from high school. And I always had a pretty good one. I started in commercial aviation, and then I was like, I got my licenses, I got a commercial instrument, all that stuff. And I was like, you know what? I don't think I want to be a bus driver for the rest of my life. And I'd taken all my electives in anthropology classes, and I ended up going into that and going into CRM archaeology after that. And, but I mean, working at what did you say? A particle accelerator?
No, I worked in semiconductors.
Semiconductors. That's right, man. Well, that is totally awesome because as everybody knows that is a decent scientist, you need to bring multiple disciplines together in order to really get the most out of something. You know what I mean? I mean, we can't just be sitting in our offices reading the Journal of Archaeological Science every day, although that's where a lot of this good stuff comes from, which is where this article comes from. But you got to take your head out of that and look at some other stuff sometimes, look at some other disciplines, read some other articles and say, you know what, I wonder if that technique could be used to apply to archaeology or to what I'm doing or to a problem I'm trying to solve. And that's how we end up with things like radiocarbon dating and, XRF and all kinds of other things that we use in archaeology. Now, drones is, huge in archaeology and obviously did not start here. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And the article that Paul originally sent me was actually from Heritage Daily. We'll link to that and the Journal of Archaeological Science article as well. But the Heritage Daily one is called Archaeologists Teach Computers to Sort Ancient Pottery. So let's first talk about what the problem was that you were trying to solve. What brought you to this problem? And then we'll talk about your solutions for it.
Okay, well, let's start with a little bit of background on ceramic classification, and particularly in the American Southwest. Back in the 1920s, I think at one of the very first PECOS conferences, they came up with a standard system for classifying pottery in general and decorated pottery in particular. And the system they came up with was first wares, which describe pottery that has common physical characteristics, a common looking paste, a similar temper, slipped or unslipped, and so on, and typically also found in a common geographic area. And then within where there are subtypes called types, which describe, for decorated ceramics, different design patterns. In Southwestern pottery, typically you'll have simpler designs earlier on, and then as time moves on, you can get either small changes or large changes in the overall design patterns that you find on that pottery. And each of those sort of jumps in design characteristics is called a type. And sometimes you're going to have subtypes called varieties within there. And these provide critical information about the time period of the site where you find these particular pieces of pottery. If you find, obviously, types of pottery that came earlier, that means the site is early. And if you find types that come late, obviously the site comes late.
Sure.
And using tree ring dating, they've correlated these types with particular time periods. It also offers information about the cultural affiliation of a particular site, and also gives information about trade patterns. I mean, there are cultures in the Southwest that produced particular kinds of pottery and then traded it widely. And that can give you information about, what were those trade patterns? Who do they actually interact with back in the past? As a result of decades of work, a lot of which was done here in Flagstaff, Arizona, where I live at the Museum of Northern Arizona by a guy named Harold Colton, who founded the museum and, developed many of these typology definitions. For many of these pottery wares, there are very, very clear definitions about what kind of designs are associated with which particular types. And you read through the definitions and it's like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. The problem is a lot of this, with many archaeologists, it's a very subjective analysis of the designs. You can hand one piece of pottery to multiple archaeologists and they can disagree on specifically what kind of type that is.
Right.
And that introduces errors in terms of, what time period that particular site was from, what were the trade patterns and so on. Starting in the 1970s, there were some studies done by Paul Fish of the University of Arizona, where he handed off pottery samples to 4 different archaeologists working at the Museum of Northern Arizona, all of whom had been trained the same classification system. And they agreed 70 to 78% of the time. And there have been studies that show even worse than that, where you can have one piece of pottery assigned to 13 different types by 20 different archaeologists and spanning, 500 years. And, that's not a good situation.
Right.
One of the reviewers of our article called this archaeology's dirty little secret. It's like, ultimately what they hope is that people will make mistakes in one direction or another direction in terms of type, but that they'll all average out in the end. But it's not clear that happens.
Yeah.
I did a lot of work in the field as a field archaeologist with, going out to sites and looking at pottery and making my best guess. But it was always frustrating because, I could never be 100% sure. Back around the middle of the 2010s, I started hearing about a new kind of image classification system that relied on deep learning, on artificial intelligence. And I thought, well, this might be an alternative to, human classification.
Right. Because
the accuracies that they were getting with these new systems were comparable to what a human being could do in terms of looking at a picture and determining what was in it. So started working in 2016 with Chris Downham, my collaborator at Northern Arizona University. And we got some interesting results. I think that the very first thing you need to do in this situation is you need to collect a set of ceramic pieces, what we call sherds, and hand them off to experts and see how good a job they do in terms of classifying them. And what we found was that these experts, and we're talking about people with decades of experience classifying these, agreed on the types between about 53 and 63% of the time, right? Which is, disconcerting. Yeah. We were able to sort of find a set of sherds where there was some level of agreement, of consensus on the types. And then we took those sherd images with the consensus types and we fed them into a kind of artificial intelligence model called a convolutional neural network. And what it does is it teaches itself to recognize types of sherds. You feed in images, and it runs through the model, and it comes up with an answer at the end. And if the answer is wrong, which it typically is to begin with, what it actually does is it tweaks the model so the next time it sees the same image, it's more likely to get the correct answer. And you do that thousands and thousands of times with these images, and ultimately the model winds up tweaking itself to a point where the accuracy becomes reasonable.
Okay. So let's take a step back, right? This is pretty awesome. I like how this works, but let's talk about that classification of pottery, because some of my more savvy listeners, and we have a lot of archaeologists that listen to this show, they might be thinking the same thing, but my experience with pottery comes mostly from the southeastern United States, where you rarely see any painted or decorated pottery because it's sitting in acidic soil. So you're going more off of thickness and temper, and there are some other textural designs like punctated and, I'm forgetting all the terms, but, where they take like reed impressed and stuff like that, where basically they're making designs almost like rock art, you know what I mean, on pottery though.
Sure.
But in the Southwest, there's a lot of painted pottery. And I'm just wondering how, when you say you can take a sherd and you could have 20 people look at it and they'll come up with, 10, 15 different ideas of what that might be. And that is a problem. But how often do these styles morph through time? Much like evolution, you don't just sprout an arm, right? There's little micro changes through time, and you have to look at big time sequences to really get those markers where you say, okay, this is categorically different. This is different. This is different. How did you guys first decide, okay, we're going to call these, stopping points. We're going to come to a consensus and say, this is this, this is this, and this is this, in order to teach a computer how to recognize one thing from another and not just a variation of something. You know what I mean?
Well, I think you've hit on an interesting point here, which is that, you would expect that design styles would not change dramatically as a function of time. You get like a gradual evolution. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the problem with the whole issue of types. It's sort of like you're putting things into boxes and saying there are clear demarcations between different types, but that's probably not happening.
Right.
But the system that's been set up is basically, you got, type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, and you put it into that box. Part of the beauty of this particular approach is that it's not actually identifying a specific type. What it's doing is it's producing a confidence level for that particular type. So if you have, say, one particular type and it has a very high confidence, it's on a scale of 0 to 1, you can say, okay, this falls very comfortably into the middle of the box. It's very clearly that. But you can get results where you say, okay, it's got 70% confidence that it's one particular type, but maybe 25% that it's another type as well too. So you can actually monitor the shifts in the designs of types from one group to another. And
I imagine as you go farther in this process and show it more and more types, a 70-20 might be its own type, right? Like if it's 70% this and 20% that.
Yeah. It's micro seriation, basically. It's sort of looking at, not putting it into solid, divisions, like I said, but rather taking a look at this as a continuum. Mm-hmm. Now there are some types that very clearly fall into their own little group that don't have a lot of relationship with other ones. But what we've seen is that there is a sort of like a continuum starting with the earliest types and moving along, where you can actually see with this process the overlaps between one style and another style.
Okay. Wow. That's awesome. All right. Well, I want to get into the actual, how do I say it, teaching of the computer and how this worked, and a little more explanation of the convolutional neural network. I think our audience would appreciate that. But I feel like that's going to be an in-depth conversation. So let's go ahead and take our first break, and we'll come back on the other side and keep talking to Leszek Pawlowicz about how to teach a computer how to recognize pottery when we can barely even teach field techs how to do that. Back in a minute. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code Archaeotech. That's ARCHAEOTECH. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 155. And I am talking with Leszek Pawlowicz, and we are talking about teaching computers how to do pottery. So let's talk a little bit more about the convolutional neural network, the CNNs that make this thing all possible. I mean, obviously, we don't want to go too deep into the weeds on an archaeology podcast about what this is, but I'm interested in like what this looks like, you know, what to use a weird phrase, what this looks like on paper. You know what I mean? Like, what is a convolutional neural network? How does this kind of fit together, and how does it work?
All right, let me see if I can sort of put it into simple terms. In a convolutional neural network, what you do is you feed in an image. Well, actually, you can feed in a whole bunch of different kinds of data, but in this case, we're just talking about images. And there's a sort of a first stage where it's taking the image and it's putting it through a set of visual filters that are looking for things like, you know, initially edges, curves, shapes, very simple things. And then it kind of compresses it down, puts it through another set of filters that sort of start taking these, you know, edges and shapes and trying to combine them together into other more complicated shapes, and so on and so forth. And at the end of this first stage, you wind up with a set of numbers that describes what particular features are visible within that image. And then it takes that set of numbers and feeds into a second stage where it associates the features that you've derived using these filters with the specific, you know, type or category of that particular image. You know, and now in the standard ones, you'll see, you know, it might look at, you know, what kind of dog it is, you know, is it a boat, is it a view or whatever. In this case, we're looking at geometric designs on ceramics, and what you need to do is to set up all these filters and all this categorization information in the model so it's able to recognize the geometric patterns. And the beauty of convolutional neural networks is that, you know, they teach themselves what features are important in classifying an image based on the category. Okay. And you just run the image through these filters. It comes up with a set of numbers that passes it on to the categorization, and then it comes up with an answer at the other end. If the answer is right, it's great. If the answer is wrong, it goes back and fixes the model to make it more likely that it'll predict the same result next time. And you just keep on running pictures over and over again until the accuracy improves to a point where it kind of maxes out. And then that's the best you can do. And then you've got a final model that's capable of taking an image and this time usually producing the correct answer.
Wow. Teaching a computer this way really sounds... Well, it sounds futuristic, to be honest, because you're teaching it how to see pottery. Other people are teaching it how to identify, like you said, boats and dogs and things like that. I mean, isn't this, just to go out of archaeology for a half second here, isn't this a real slippery slope to like true AI? Because as soon as you teach it to start recognizing different emotions and then doing, you know, different things like that, you add all these things up into a single CNN, for example. How is that different from an intelligence? You know what I mean?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about this. The current forms of, I'm calling it artificial intelligence, but that's not really the case. It's more accurately called machine learning. And all of these particular approaches typically only work on a very narrow range of problems. So I have a model that I've trained on one specific ware of ceramics. It's not going to work on other ceramics types. I have to go off and train an entirely different model for the different wares and so on. If you talk to anyone who works in the field of artificial intelligence,
they will tell you that not only are they not close to getting to like a general artificial intelligence that would be able to do the things that you're talking about, they don't even know how to start going that way. They've come up with a set of systems that work on very well on specific individual problems, but doing what people do, which is to pull in stuff from a whole bunch of different areas and do original thinking, they're nowhere even close.
Wow.
In fact, people use the word of artificial intelligence for what I'm doing and for what others are doing so much that they've actually come up with an entirely different set of words to describe, the original idea behind artificial intelligence, which is going to create a computer that thinks like a person. And they call that GoFi, which stands for good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. And we're nowhere near that.
Okay. Well, that's comforting, I guess. Although I think it'll be fine working for the machines. I think they'll run a nice, efficient civilization. So I'm all for it.
Yeah.
Back to
we've actually gotten some feedback from some archaeologists who have expressed some fear that, the computers are coming for our jobs.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're not. What they're coming is to do some things better than the way that archaeologists can do them right now. But this frees up archaeologists to do the things that they're really good at, which is taking a look at all the data and trying to figure out what it all means.
Right. To be honest, this is what I'm about to talk about, but it's on steroids, right? So I work with a couple different companies. Right now I work with a company called WildNote in an attempt to bring archaeologists in the 21st century just from a get off of paper standpoint. And that is still a very big conversation in archaeology. There was just a huge discussion on one of the big Facebook groups for archaeologists. Basically, somebody was saying it was a whole discussion about paper versus tablets, and people saying tablets are the best, and people saying, you'll never pry my notebook out of my hands. I'm always going to use paper. And we're still having this discussion in 2021. And some of the arguments around that are, yes, the technology is going to take our jobs and put us out of work. And, we're going to do drone surveys and we won't need archaeologists to do pedestrian survey anymore. But really it just makes us more efficient. It makes us better. And just taking your survey forms off and making them digital, not to go down that rabbit hole too much, but you can add more efficient things like drop downs and, selectable things. So you don't have to rely on people, guessing at something that's not even part of that region. You know what I mean? Like they might have experience all over the country and something comes into their brain. I'm in Nevada right now and we have a lot of Elko corner notch projectile points. Well, like you were saying, we were talking about styles. I mean, there are Elko corner notch shaped projectile points all over the world. I mean, it's like when you look at, you say, I want to travel around using an engine and four wheels. You're probably going to picture a car. It's the right tool for the job. Well, if you say, I want to shoot this kind of animal with a piece of stone attached to the end of a piece of wood, you're probably going to come up with not too many different shapes to do that with. So, yeah.
About 20 years ago, when they turned off selective availability for GPS, I can remember talking to archaeologists about using GPS and being told, well, no, we've done mapping by hand forever, and we don't really see any reason to go on to this. This is just a fad. It'll all go away. And, I think things have turned around since then, but, sometimes people are so set in the way that they've been doing things that you sort of have to show them that, this is a better way to do things.
Right. It just makes us better scientists, especially something like this model. So let's bring it back to this model because you mentioned feeding it images. I'm wondering, and I don't know what stage you guys are in, because I know when papers actually come out, it's probably been years that you've been working on this, but I'm wondering what the quality of the image has to be. Does this has to be like a laboratory image on a sterile background, or can you literally take images of pottery shot in the field where somebody may have laid it down in the gravel or laid it on the back of their clipboard or even in their hand? And do you have to clean those up if you have to use those, right? Do you have to snip it out so that the computer just sees that? How good do the images have to be?
They have to be decent. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think looking at the sherds where the computer is making mistakes, quite often it will be ones where the image is smudged somewhat, or not the image, but the actual sherd itself, where it's like some areas have firing clouds or firing smudges or whatever that obscure some of the designs, and people are able to pick that out, but the computer struggles with that a little bit. So you need to find sherds that have reasonably clear designs, and also ones that have enough of the design to make it diagnostic. I mean, if you pick up a sherd and it's just got like one little decorated stripe in a corner somewhere, there's no way the computer's going to be able to do that. It has to see enough of the design characteristics that allow it to diagnose what kind of sherd it is in order to make that.
Yeah.
For what we've been doing, we've also been basically putting the sherds onto a white background, but that's something you can automate in a program so that it will be able to sort of cut that out automatically.
Right. How far are we from the time when somebody working in the field in the area where this type of wear is prevalent snaps a picture, maybe even on a clean background, right? Snaps a picture in the field and they have cell service and they upload it to your model and they get an answer back right away. How close are we to doing that?
So we are maybe weeks away from that.
Really?
Yes. So I'm not a smartphone programmer. So, we've had plans to sort of, start talking to people about creating these kind of apps. But we found a company that was producing templates where they said, you just drop in this model and run it through the programming environment, and it'll create an app for you that'll do that automatically.
Wow.
And I tried that and wound up with an app that crashed my phone every time I tried to run it. But I got back to the company and they got back to me and they said they're going to work on seeing why I'm having problems with crashing. And if they can figure it out and fix it, we may have something that we can at least demonstrate in the very near future. We're talking about weeks.
Wow. For some reason, I thought this type of model would be something that was too much for even a modern smartphone to handle, and that the processing would have to be done offline or not off the phone and on servers. That's why I was thinking a web-based approach. But you're saying that this model is something that once you figure it out could actually be put into an app and downloaded and theoretically used offline in the field. Yeah.
I mean, you certainly could create a web app to do that. And
sure,
there are some situations where that might be preferable. But if you're out in the field, especially in the Southwest, there's going to be huge areas where you're not going to get cell coverage and you're just going to be off on your own. And having the ability to go off and do this independently of the web is a big advantage.
All right. So let's talk too about the reception here. You've mentioned a few people when we were talking about, computers stealing our jobs and some people thinking that, but what has been some of the other responses to this model and just this idea in general that you've heard?
Well, we've worked with a number of expert archaeologists up here in the Flagstaff area, and all of them have been really supportive and think it's a really cool idea. We've talked to some other groups of archaeologists dealing with entirely different wares to see if they'd be interested in cooperating. And reception's been mixed. I think one group had, sort of to condense all their statements down into just a few bullet points. They said they didn't think it would work. They didn't want it to work because it would take away work from archaeologists. And they had also spent, many years of their lives learning how to classify ceramics. And they considered that their personal intellectual property, and they didn't feel like cooperating in an effort that would basically diminish their personal value.
Right. Wow.
And I can understand it. It's just that the advantages of this technique are so manifest. I mean, if you talk to any government archaeologists who supervise, projects out in the field, a lot of them will say that they simply can't rely on ceramic classifications that are done by field archaeologists just because they don't have the training and expertise to do it accurately. And this would fix that problem.
Right. And not only that, but with this kind of data, we might be able to even find classifications we didn't even know existed because there was some minute difference that was different enough, but just not different enough that we could recognize it with the naked eye, unless you're really a ceramics expert in that area. But the computer can see it and it sees it every single time. It's like, hey, this one every time.
Yeah. And one of the byproducts of this whole process is you can actually take an image of a sherd and you can compare it to thousands of sherd images, and it will come back with the closest matches to those particular designs. So,
wow.
if you're doing a dig and you want to find, which pieces come from the same vessel, this would be one way to sort of narrow down the search field to find out which sherds most closely match one particular sherd and get the ones that you might be able to reconstruct. Or, and this may not be possible, but it's a possibility. You can take a look at sherds and see what sherds closely match from other sites, and you might even be able to trace down who the actual potter was based on the designs that they're using.
Nice. So what you need to, I guess, make other models that can do the same thing to other types of wares and things like that, you need massive data sets, right? It just made me think of a potential partnership, although I don't know the legalities of this, but have you heard of the Digital Index of North American Archaeology? I think it's what it's called, DINA.
No, I haven't. I've heard of TDAR.
TDAR's right in your backyard. In fact, we're interviewing Chris Nicholson from TDAR in a couple of weeks here. Yeah, and TDAR might be a good space too, but DINA specifically, and I think it's DINAA, DINA. They are basically, they kind of started in the Eastern Midwest and Southeast, and they're basically gathering together databases, like SHPO databases of archaeology. And they're tagging everything from what I understand. Now, I haven't talked to anybody at DINA. Eric Kanza is one of the people that helps run DINA. And I've talked to him before in the past on some of our podcasts about DINA. They've been working on this project for a long time. And I really should get in touch with them and get an update on this. But they're basically, like I said, tagging and categorizing every single piece of data in there. So it all has its own identifier. And, if you said, I'm willing to bet that if you said, show me all the, sherds that have been classified of this type from this area, then it would just pull them all together. Now, there's issues with access and things like that because they're not just making it widely available. They're using data sets from 15, 20 different states. So, but man, that would be a great source if something could be done with that. You know what I mean? So
yeah. There's another similar project. I don't know if you've heard of it, called Cyber Southwest.
No.
Yeah, it's basically a cooperation between University of Arizona and Arizona State University. And what they're doing is they're collecting data from sites all across the Southwest, and they're trying to use that information to analyze social networks, relationships between different sites across the Southwest, in both in a geographic sense and also in a chronological sense as well, too.
Yeah. All right. Well, that sounds like a good point to take our final break. Let's do that and come back on the other side and continue talking about this because I want to see where you guys are going from here. In the meantime, if you're hearing this podcast, we've revitalized our newsletter, which, don't roll your eyes, newsletters can be good. We're sending out news articles that we find interesting. Like this one right here is going to be in our newsletter on Monday, which is the week that you're hearing this. And then on Fridays, we're sending out a newsletter that have all the podcasts for the past 7 days. So if you're interested, go to archpodnet.com and just scroll up the page a little bit and it will pop up and you can drop your email address in there and you'll be added to our list. So let's take a break and come back in just a minute. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to archpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's archpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. Welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 155. And we're wrapping up this discussion with Leszek Pawlowicz. And I want to know where you guys are going from here. You mentioned communicating with other people and getting other ware types and, seeing if we can, make some sort of partnership there. But what other stuff have you guys looked at? And if you can talk about it, are you actively trying to train other models to do other things right now?
So we are almost done with our next paper. And this is related, but kind of looks at things in a different way. Imagine you've got thousands and thousands of pictures of sherds. Mm-hmm. There's no way you're going to be able to memorize all these, especially when they look very, very similar, and organizing them and visualizing them and trying to get an overall picture of what's going on is really difficult. We're working on a paper that will show how you can basically take all these sherd images, you can group them based on similarity and then visualize them simultaneously. So you can zoom into individual areas. You can, see how designs change as you move from one type to another. And this is hopefully going to be an aid in terms of seeing whether or not the current classification systems actually do a good job of breaking down sherds into different types. So that will hopefully be submitted in a couple of weeks. We are working on another type of ceramic ware that's local to the area. And we're going to try a different approach where we're basically going to take these and we're going to run them through the model that was trained on one specific ware and see whether or not that model is transferable to an entirely different ware without any modifications, and see whether or not some sort of natural classification system develops out of that.
Wow.
We are going to be having a little mini conference with all of our classification experts sometime this summer to sort of talk about these results, and where in the places where the computer and the experts disagree, see if we can figure out why they disagreed and come up with methods to make the classifications that are used for training a little bit more accurate, because that'll also improve the overall accuracy of the models. What we would really like to do, and we're not sure it'll work, but there's a good chance it'll work, is instead of classifying sherds by specific types, we'd like to see whether or not we can't make a direct correlation between the designs on a sherd and when it was made. Because then you could go off and immediately find out, within some reasonable time range, when a particular site was occupied.
How difficult is it for someone to develop something like this? Is a convolutional neural network software, so to speak, is this something that you can just get from somewhere and start feeding it data? Or did you guys have to write this code to make it work?
Okay. I mean, I wrote the code, although it might be more accurate to say that I Frankensteined it from a number of different sources out on the web. And that's one way to do it. And one advantage of that is it gives you, sort of like access to, different stages of the classification procedure, and you can output data that you can use later on in different analyses. However, there are sort of canned or commercial programs that will do something similar. They don't necessarily have, give you the same flexibility that doing it, by twiddling with all the little settings, but, they're at least a starting point.
Right.
For that matter, in the paper, it was published in Journal of Archaeological Science, there's a link to an archive where we posted the source code that we wrote to do this. And we also posted a little demonstration program where basically we provide the models and we provide our full database of sherd images. And we also provide some test images that were not part of the whole training process. And basically you can feed them to the model and see how it makes its predictions, have it match up, what are the closest matching sherd images to your sample sherd, or you can even take your own sherds and run them through there and see how it does on those.
Wow. Nice. What are some of the limitations to this type of program? Like, is there anything that you've come across in your reading and your studying up on this that is just too complicated for this type of code right now? Or is it just math to the computer and it can basically learn anything?
The biggest limitation we have right now is the accuracy of the training set. On the training set, if you compare the humans with, their predictions on the consensus data set, their accuracy runs anywhere from 72 to 86%. So there is some level of uncertainty baked into that training set. If we can improve that, then we can improve the overall results. Beyond that, I don't think that there's any profound limitation on this method in predicting stuff. I mean, this is, in a general sense, this is a kind of system where if you provide it with images in 1,000 different categories, dogs, cats, boats, cars, automobiles, it can classify the images with an accuracy on the order of about 88 or 89% for the exact match, and over 96% if you think about the top 5 matches.
Yeah, this is like the commercialization of, and I don't know how long they've been doing this, for a long time from what I can understand, but like a Google image search. I literally just used Google image search a couple of days ago when I took a picture of something at the Met Museum when we were in New York City a few weeks ago, and I couldn't remember what it was called. It was some Japanese statue, and I didn't take a picture of the identification plate, and I kept trying to research it based on just what it was, and I forgot all about Google image search. I was trying to type in some characteristics of it to try to find this Japanese god to figure out which one it was. And I just dropped it in Google image search and had it in seconds. And that is phenomenal to me,
Yeah, and they're using convolutional neural networks to do this. So, I mean, it's the exact same technology. I might also add that while our article was in press, I saw that at the recent Society for American Archaeology virtual conference, there were two posters by two different groups that were trying to apply the same method to different ceramic wares.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think there was a group out of Crow Canyon Archaeological Center that was trying to do it with Mesa Verde black on white. And then one guy out at Harvard, I think Jacob Sedig is his name, who was looking at using this to classify Mimbres ceramics from southern New Mexico.
Is it just a coincidence that they're also trying to classify ceramics, or ceramics just that hard to classify accurately that people are focusing on it?
I think probably it's just that ceramics are so hard to classify accurately, and that some people, not all archaeologists, but some archaeologists realize this is an issue that needs to be solved somehow, because it's difficult to get people to agree on stuff. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like projectile points are next. I know people have tried it in the past, and there was a person, his name is also Chris. I can't remember his last name, but he was out of the Southeast. He was trying to do a very similar thing with projectile points in the Southeast.
Yeah, and he gave up on that because it wasn't working. He had a website where you could upload a picture and get results. And I tried that on a few points, and it just wasn't making it.
Yeah, I don't think he had a big enough initial data set.
Yeah, well, it's funny. My original idea was to use this with projectile points and not on ceramics. And I kind of thought, well, the problem is taking a good picture that shows the specific details of the projectile point is very difficult. I mean, you can get the outline, but in terms of the flaking patterns, that's difficult to do. Now, I've worked on a different project using a custom photographic method that does a wonderful job of doing that, but it's not necessarily all that practical out in the field.
Sure.
I mean, if I give you an outline of a Clovis point, a Midland point, and the Folsom point, and just the outline, no flaking patterns, are you going to be able to differentiate the three of those?
Not very easily.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah. I mean, field applications, of course, are where we want to be with this. Cause I mean, I do a lot of my work in Nevada, and I mean, unless something's really special, we don't collect anything. So it's all about taking photographs in the field. And man, I am just waiting for the day when, like, I have an iPhone 12 Pro Max sitting right here. Right. And there is so much good in the face scanner on that thing when I try to unlock my phone. I mean, I can be in really low, not very good light, and it still recognizes my face. And if my wife grabs my phone and tries to unlock it, even in low light, like when we're driving or something like that, I mean, it's good enough that it knows she's a different person, obviously. Right. And she just kind of like points it at me while I'm driving, and it unlocks my phone. And if they could just turn that scanner around to the backside and we could use it on other stuff, I imagine the photographs that we could take in the field that have depth and texture to them. And I mean, a program would have to be written for that, I'm sure. But if they would just open up that face scanning technology to something else, and that mapping, man, that would change everything. Then we could have those really good photos like you're talking about, and then use them on models like this.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how far we are from that, but it's too far. Oh man. Sometimes I wish I was born 50, 100 years later, but then it's a slippery slope. And then I wish I was born 1,000 years later, 2,000. What are we going to do? Man. So let's talk about your blue sky stuff here. Like where money's no object, you've got a blank check, like Ira Flato used to say, or still says on Science Friday. What would you do? What do you want to do with this if, like I said, time, money, and research goals were no object?
Well, the thing we would really like to do is, I talked about how we might have a demo app for using this out in the field, but what we'd like to do is develop an app where you take a photograph and it characterizes it, it tells you the type in the field, but then when you get back into civilization, it uploads the image and also the appropriate metadata associated with it. And you start creating a database of, where these ceramics are found. And with this database, you can use this to improve the model. You can also improve the database to match things, closer and closer together. Obviously, we also want to go off and develop models that'll work with other ceramic wares. and probably also, develop a system where you kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Some sort of way to manage the models so that not everyone doesn't just create their own model and use that out in the field. Sort of like have a standardized system for people to create their models, register them. And then when you take pictures and you characterize them, you say, yeah, we're using this model and so on. And then when a better model comes along a little bit later on, you basically update it and you say, okay, now we're using the more updated model. Just sort of like some kind of system for gathering data and managing it in a way that, makes sense.
Yeah. And it sounds like, man, some partnerships with other applications out there would be such a great idea. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is like a lot of people use Collector, but the problem with Collector as a collection medium for data like this, even if you're taking pictures in there, is a lot of times it doesn't stay on, that's owned by Esri. A lot of times it doesn't stay on their servers. It just goes to your own, that's the whole point of it. It goes to your own Esri instance in your own servers and things like that. But like I was saying, the company that I consult with, WildNote, I mean, I could see a partnership with somebody like them because every single photograph that's taken on the WildNote software, which can be used offline, so people are using it in the field. There's more and more archaeologists using it every day. It's largely used by biologists and other people in the field, only because, as we mentioned in the beginning of the show, it's hard to convince archaeologists to use technology. But that being said, it's getting better every year. But there's, potentially thousands, if not tens of thousands of images being stored in their database, as long as the client doesn't archive or delete even if they archive the project on WildNote, it's still there. But if they delete the project, then it actually does delete everywhere. But if we could get companies to opt in to having, giving a company, an organization like yours access to this sort of database, so you can just have those images, the collected metadata, where they're from, and nothing about the client, stuff like that. All that can stay off, but we collect the metadata with those photos, the GPS coordinates, all the normal stuff that your onboard tablet or phone GPS records, speed, direction, all those kinds of weird things. And you've got a ready-made database right there. You know what I mean? Like working with Dina or working with these guys, it seems like if we could just get those kinds of partnerships established, then you could fast track this kind of thing as far as having a massive data set goes. So, man, that would be really cool.
Yeah, well, that's what we're hoping for.
Sounds like we all just need to work together as usual, right? Because like you said, people, what you don't want is people developing their own models, basically. And then basically we're just back to square one, because that's what people have done in their heads for decades. They've got their own model of what things look like. And our brains are excellent pattern recognition devices, but they also lie to us frequently. So, and our biases take over. Whereas with computers, obviously it's pretty black and white, it's this or it's this, to this degree of confidence level, like you said. And that's really what we need in this science if we're going to do things right.
Yeah, I think biases is the key word. You go off and you do this and you create your own, mental models of, what sets of designs correspond to particular types. And those mental models may not be the same across different people. And, this sort of sidesteps that whole issue, saying you've got a model that will always give you, if you feed it an image, it'll, today, next year, if it's the same model, it'll give you exactly the same results. And people can't do that.
No. And, again, the problem with people is you may know maybe even 3 or 4 different types of patterns really well, but that just means that you're basically going to classify everything into one of those 3 or 4 and then other, right? It's just, your brain is automatically going to try to put what you're seeing into one of those boxes, and you just don't have the right number of boxes. You don't have all the boxes like the computer does and can just put it exactly where it needs to go. So, yeah.
And, the other thing is that you have people out there who have been doing this for a long, long time and have these mental images, and regrettably, they're not always going to be around.
Yeah, that's true.
And one thing you can do with this particular approach is you can have one person go off and, classify a whole bunch of ceramics, and then just use that person's classification to create a computer model that kind of mimics their particular approach. So that if, when they're not around anymore, you can say, okay, they classified it back in the past as being such and such. If we give them a new sherd, how would they have classified that? So sort of like capturing their expertise in a computer model that can be passed on indefinitely.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I hope we can have you on again later when this other paper gets published. And I mean, honestly, anytime you guys want to come on and talk about what you're currently doing, or, we can help beg for data sets on the podcast and just see how we can help move this thing forward. So Leszek, Pawlowicz, thanks for coming on the show.
All right. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks for listening to the Archaeotech podcast. Links to items mentioned on the show are in the show notes at www.archpodnet.com/archaeotech. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com and paul@lugal.com. Support the show by becoming a member at archpodnet.com/members. The music is a song called Off Road and is license free from Apple. Thanks for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.
Well, we got a minute. I'm going to buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.